Steve's presentation for today is Will the Show Go On? The S&P 500, I think, had its biggest weekly gain in months last week. So, Steve, very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say and whether the show will indeed go on. Thank you very much.
So let's get right into it. So the first thing, let's just talk about the performance for the last quarter. At the top right hand side, I know it's a bit small on your screen. It's got all those lovely net group shades of green, so maybe not that clear, but right in the middle, the Rainmaker Fund. What you wanted to do in this past quarter is you wanted to have banks, and you didn't want to have any resources, or certainly not Naspers or Prosus. But of course, it's a portfolio, so you unfortunately have a diversified portfolio. You don't always have the pick. But what happened during the quarter? Well, the first thing, the banks did exceptionally well. After the whole COVID-induced sort of moratorium on dividends, they finally started paying dividends again. And what was also quite nice is that we saw them actually writing back some of those very big provisions that they had for COVID bad loans, which actually didn't turn out to be that bad. Secondly, we also saw a lot more corporate action in the SA market, which is actually quite encouraging. SA corporate are not sitting on their hands, they're not bemoaning COVID, they're really out there trying to do what's right for the business. So whether it's RMI, unbundling some of their assets, Imperial getting an offer to be taken out. Unfortunately, it's no longer something we can invest in then. MTN announcing all kinds of actions, listing some of their subsidiaries in Africa, selling the tower, or listing the tower portfolio, selling some towers in South Africa. The guys are very busy to try and unlock value for shareholders. Telkom also talking about listing SwiftNet, which is their tower portfolio. So certainly very encouraging to see that. Platinum stocks has been a seesaw for this year. If you take Amplats as an example, first quarter up 50%, second quarter down 20%, third quarter down 22%. So looking quite bad into the quarter that we're reporting on here. But if you look at this month, and we're only 3 weeks into the month, Amplats is already up another 24%. So quite a bit of seesaw that we saw there. Unfortunately, Naspers Prosus forced through their very complicated transaction. You try and unlock value, which we were about skeptical about, and so far it's been value destructive. It hasn't really helped the unlocking of the discount. At the same time, unfortunately for them, bad timing, lots of regulatory changes in China, and that's hurt and impacted the Tencent share price, and that's obviously had a big negative impact. And we talk a bit more about those sort of prosperity regulations that's been implemented or being talked about a lot in China at the moment. The rand depreciated 5.7% against the US dollar, but offshore markets were kind of flattish for the year, for the quarter, after having a very strong start to the year. So that didn't really help the portfolio off all that much, with a lackluster performance. On the right-hand side, there's a table that shows you the big contributors to performance. As I said, it's the banks, MTN, and so forth. And then, unfortunately, on the negative side, you had the Platinum Group companies, but also Alibaba and then Naspers, and both of them very much because of the regulatory changes in China. So let's just talk about that in a moment. First thing is, I titled this presentation, Will the Show Go On? So what do we mean with that? We've had a couple of years, in some cases decades, of very strong tailwinds behind equity markets. What am I talking about there? Well, first, commodity cycle. We've had very strong demand growth with lots of developments in emerging markets that sucked in all those commodities. At the same time, environmental, social, and government standards around the world has been tightened, and that's actually had an impact. It actually constrained supply from the commodity side, so it's been very positive for commodity prices. That's been quite a long tailwind. We've also had this whole growth of what's called the platform economy. And what do I mean by that? On the top right-hand side, you see the so-called Metcalfe graph. And what it says is, and this typically comes from the telecoms industry, where the value of your network is actually the square of the number of users. And it's the same on the platform, whether it's social media like Facebook, or whether it's a Uber Eats, or whether it's online classifieds. As you increase the numbers, the value of that business is not just a factor of the number of users, it's actually the square thereof. So as I showed an example there, if you have a network or a platform with 100 users, there's potentially 4,950 connections between those 100 people. If you double the number of users, the number of connections actually goes up to 20,000, fourfold for a doubling in the number of users. And that we've seen exploding around the world. And certainly the internet and everything online, smartphones have facilitated that. At the same time, we've had globalization, which has been very good in terms of driving deflation. With integrated supply chains, you could manufacture anything in the cheapest spot in the world, very quickly move it around. And it's been very deflationary across the world. I don't think we realize how beneficial it's been for the average consumer around the world. It's also developed emerging markets, brought a lot of people out of poverty, which again created a whole new bunch of consumers around the world. However, Globalization we've seen in the last couple of years has now led to more nationalism around the world. The US, that's had a fantastic century last year. Their middle class has basically been gutted. There's a lot of the factory jobs have been moved to other countries. So there's all kinds of nationalistic strife that's going on around the world. Although all of those things have been quite positive, then last year we had COVID. Obviously, the first lockdown and the shock of having a global pandemic knocked markets, but then all of a sudden people realized, hang on, there are things like work from home, everything online, lots of stimulus, effectively free interest rates being thrown at the market, and that's actually marginally positive. That's why I have sort of that diagonal arrow pointing upwards, quite positive for the market. But then we started to get the negative impact coming earlier this year, where we realized that microchips are just in short supply. Global supply chains have been thrown in array, and it's made life very difficult for people to move things around. And at the same time, we now see energy supply constraints. You've seen what's happening in the UK, and that's a graph I have at the bottom right-hand side. Natural gas prices that you use to heat your house, and we know what the UK winter looks like. It's gone up fivefold in the last couple of months. I mean, it is unheard of. So all kinds of things that are now shaking the market. Again, hence the title, Will the Show Go On? What will be the impact? But before we get to the answer to that question, let's just quickly have a look at what's happening in China with this common prosperity and the regulations, and just all the confusion around that. Very simplistically, and I'm actually starting in the middle of the slide on the left-hand side, what do the Chinese want to achieve, or the Chinese state want to achieve with common prosperity? They talk about common economic as well as social prosperity. They've uplifted almost 800 people into middle class in the last couple of years. GDP in China has grown tenfold from 2000 to 2020. It's been an economic miracle. However, what they want to do is take another 400, or the bottom half of that middle class, and move them further up the middle class ladder. China is sitting at about $10,000 per person on a GDP level. They want to move that even further up in terms of getting effectively making sure that your 1.4 billion people in the country are relatively happy, stable, and prosperous as a common theme. Now, uplifting 400 million people is quite a positive sense from a consumer sentiment in terms of economic development, but you have to get there in very different ways than what we are used to in the West. In the West, it's white papers and consultations and all kinds of things. In China, they do it slightly differently. So the first thing they did is they went after school tutoring. They basically killed that industry and said, this is not good. People were spending a disproportionate amount of their own disposable income on after-school tutoring, on healthcare, on housing, speculation around the housing market. And you've seen the impact in the last couple of weeks with Evergrande, one of the big real estate developers, basically going bankrupt. Lots of speculation in terms of apartments. The government saying housing should be for living in, not for speculation. So you stop after-school tutoring. You say you want to do it appropriately. You've got to get your education at school, not with all kinds of extra classes and bits and pieces. Gaming restrictions. Under 18, there's only so many hours a day. As a matter of fact, they've now limited it to like literally a handful of hours. I sometimes wish I could do it for my kids, but they do it. They certainly do it quite effectively in the country. They've also put very hard guardrails in place to say if you do a game, specifically these role-playing games, the characters have to be something that you can be proud of as a Chinese citizen. And in terms of language, what they look like, history has got to be representative. So very, very different to what we're used to on this side. Minimum wages for these gig workers. We talk about the guys driving around with a take-a-lot moped to come and deliver your food or deliver a package. Because they are gig workers or part-time workers, very often these guys get paid below minimum wage. The government's saying, no, we want to make sure these guys have a proper job. It's part of this common prosperity. Also in terms of anti-monopoly, to make sure that when you have these platforms, that the platforms don't create two monopolies. And for instance, companies have to choose, do I list my product on this platform? Do I list it on that platform? And you get penalized if you're on the wrong platform. Effectively, they want to break down all those type of issues. So when one stands back, you can actually see that it makes kind of sense what they're trying to do there, but it seems very harsh from a Western sort of more capitalist type approach. So what does this mean for Tencent? Well, you can do lots of numbers and lots of forecasts, but there's still lots of uncertainty. A simpler way to look at it is to simply say, if you expected 100 units of earnings for Tencent at the beginning of the year, after all these regulations have been passed, they're going to make slightly less on gaming, they're going to make slightly less on advertising, they're going to make slightly less on what they do in terms of their platform, plus they have to share more of their algorithm and so forth. You're probably going to have 10 to 20% lower earnings. At the same time, foreign investors have been shaken by this whole story. So the risk premium for investing in China has gone up by 10 to 20%, if not 30%, depending on who you talk to. Now, those two you need to add together. So there's probably a 20 to 40% discount that you have to apply to what you thought the fair value for Tencent was at the beginning of the year. So if you bake that into the current share price for Tencent, that has fallen from, it was at a peak of over 700 Hong Kong dollar. It's fallen to now close to 500. It was just below 500 earlier. It looks draconian, but actually it kind of makes sense in terms of the future that you've had. At the same time, a lot of these companies like Tencent and Alibaba and so forth have made social contributions to say they will be good citizens, they will put more money into social development, into making internet for the good. That comes at a cost. So again, that's something that you need to bake in. We've materially reduced the position in Naspers process earlier in the year, also late last year when we saw some of these things and some of these first ramblings came in. As a matter of fact, the total exposure in the portfolio as a percentage of the portfolio is now half of what it was a year ago. Some of that's because of the market movement. Most of it is because we've actually reduced the position. So the decision we have to make now is, do we take this opportunity to add to it, or do we sit on our hands and see how this whole thing develops? At the moment, we're quite cautious in terms of what the developments are, and we're watching it like a hawk. So let's get back to the show. The bottom line for us is there will always be a show. What you find, though, is that there are new seasons, and every new season brings a new nuance and it brings slightly different angles to it. And we as portfolio managers have to be on our feet, and we have to be agile and respond to this. So what is a portfolio? What does a Randmaker portfolio look like at the moment? Well, with the Rand also having been quite volatile in the recent past, we've used the opportunity when the Rand dipped very close to 14 Rand to the dollar to now go to the maximum 30% offshore allocation in the portfolio. At the same time, we've tightened up. So in South Africa, we spoke about the banks earlier. We think the banks are very well placed. They're very well capitalized. They're very well regulated. They're also very well managed. So we think the banks actually provide you with quite a good and a relatively safe position in the SA market. The SA Resources, the platinum group of metals, specifically with rhodium having come down, has kind of shaken that market a bit, but we do think there is still a lot of opportunity for the platinum group metals going into the future. What's different this time around for this boom that we had in the platinum group markets, previously when these mining companies made so much money, they immediately took the cash and they went and they started digging another hole, spending more money in capex, more development. This time they've avoided that temptation, so they've actually kept back a bit. So the balance sheets are looking very good. The cash flow is looking very good, and quite nicely we've actually seen quite nice and quite good dividends coming out of these companies. So they've had very good capital discipline, and that we appreciate about these companies. Then we see things in the SA mobile market where the companies are playing very smartly. MTN and Vodacom, as well as Telkom, are making a big play for fintech. I think people underappreciate just how big fintech has become in their portfolios. And they're now talking about functionally separating those businesses, so it'll be clear for investors exactly how much money they make and what the prospects are, as opposed to the more traditional business. At the same time, they're optimizing assets by selling off the towers, which is no longer a competitive advantage to these players. So lots of action there, which we think also provide good opportunities. And then there are some of the local companies, whether it's a Raubex that sells aggregate or make roads. These are good businesses, and they're working very hard, and I think they're good opportunities also in the mid-cap space in the SA market that we're exploiting at the moment. Then on the offshore side, what have we done in that part of the portfolio? Very much related to what we spoke about earlier about those Chinese regulations. We've lightened up on some of the platform companies in China and moved the money more towards the consumer. If there's another 400 million of these consumers being brought into the upper end of the middle class, that'll be a huge consumption boom, be it running shoes or clothing or services. We think there's some opportunity there. In the US, we focus on banks, also some fintech, insurance, and then again, some of the old boring businesses, companies that sell aggregate, that make cement. These are companies that are very attractive valuations, very good growth. The US has a requirement to spend a lot of money on infrastructure that's crumbling on that side. The US only makes about 100 million tons of cement, but they require 130 million tons a year. You can't start a new cement factory in the US because of regulatory permits and so forth, and you can't ship it in from offshore. It's too expensive for what's happening to shipping rates around the world. So captive market where you have pricing power as a proper player. At the same time, we continue to look further east. Countries like Vietnam looks quite interesting. Vietnam has got some bad press recently because they had all the COVID lockdowns, so nobody can, you couldn't get running shoes because about a third of the world's running shoes are made in Vietnam. But with that recovery, that's also a country that's probably 2 decades behind China in terms of their development, formalizing. Only 10% of their retail is formalized. So as they formalize, you think of what Shoprite has done in South Africa and Africa. There's a huge opportunity on that side. So lots of things we can do there. And then we also recently added Royal Dutch Shell. We prefer that over Sasol. What's happening in the energy markets, as we spoke before, because of ESG, all companies have basically stopped their exploration, so there's a limited supply of oil. It'll take a while for electric vehicles. We do think they will come, but it will take a while for all of those to take over from the internal combustion engines. At the meantime, there's more demand than what there is supply, and that's quite positive for these type of companies. In terms of time, I don't know, Dave, should I go to the conclusion side, or do we talk about this? Yeah, we just have one more slide. I might have gone one too far. We talk about the portfolio. One too far about the portfolio positioning. It's quite a long list on the left-hand side. The dark shaded will be the offshore holdings. I think it's sort of more or less self-explanatory, very in line with what I said in the earlier slide in terms of how we positioned for this kind of new season. In the show that we are operating at the moment. So we're quite excited about what we have there. We think it's a well-diversified portfolio between local and international, but also in the respective markets between the different drivers. So we're not banking only on tech or only on resources or only on banking. I think we have a good diversification, solid companies at good valuations with solid balance sheets and good cash flows.
Fantastic, thanks, Steve. I said we were running slightly late, but you can breathe. You can breathe. I think you flew through that quicker than you may have liked. But yeah, I really appreciate your presentation. Every time we do catch up, it's usually talking about what's happening in the tech space. I think last time we met, it was the whistleblower at Facebook was kicking off. The share price came under some pressure. I'm maybe a bit unfair on you, but I woke up this morning and I see LinkedIn are pulling out of China. I don't know if you're aware of that. I think Microsoft is the third biggest offshore holding in the portfolio. I think China is probably about 30% of LinkedIn's user base. I stand to be corrected. But is this material in Microsoft's universe?
I've been surprised with how much money they make with LinkedIn. I thought it was something where you put your CV on and hopefully someone in your neck of the woods would see it. But it's a $10 billion business for Microsoft. So it is quite significant. How much of that came from China was not clear. They didn't break that out per division. But I can understand with all the turmoil and the new regulations around the platform economies and what they need to share, that they're saying, let's just pull out of China for the time being, let somebody else play there. We've got plenty of opportunity in the rest of the world. And if you look at the other assets that Microsoft has, where, with 365, which is going towards a subscription model, that is a significant move for them. We've seen the same in the gaming industry, where instead of buying the old DVD, installing it and playing it for 4 years before you upgrade to the next, or like you had the old Microsoft Office in a box, it's now a subscription service, which is doing exceptionally well. What comes with that as well is cloud storage, and it's a bit like your garage at home. Before you know it's full, and then guys go to the storage guys and they rent another garage. It's another terabyte of online storage that you want. And Microsoft is playing that very, very well. They're the trusted player in this market, and it's still basically it's the default office system around the world. China is different. Tencent has their own version of Microsoft Office. They've got their own version, it's called VooV, of Teams meetings or Zoom meetings. Of course, they've cornered the market in China themselves. I think it's very difficult for foreign players to do that. The Chinese government would not like Microsoft Office to be the default spreadsheet or word processor in their state-owned enterprises, which you can understand from their side. So I think it's probably wise for Microsoft to say, let somebody else take that market. It's a big market, but we've got plenty of other territory that we can take around the world.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Stephen. Maybe more of an observation. I'm glad you mentioned the gas prices there. I've returned from a week's holiday, so I haven't followed the stocks too closely and what's been happening with Royal Dutch Shell, but I believe is coal, oil and gas are all up something like 95% since May in the last 6 months. And the timing's quite ironic with the COP meeting taking place in Glasgow next month, where obviously they're trying to be proponents for green energy, but I'm not sure, maybe the share price has held up reasonably well in the last week or so.
The share price has done very well. So what we're doing with that is, one is to be careful that you're not seen as being anti-ESG or that we're trying to now get into fossil fuels. Shell, very much like BP and all the other players, have very, very clear targets as to where they want to get to in terms of a green energy provider over the next 10, 20, 30 years. But the difference between them and some of the other suppliers and players in this market is that they've got a better set of assets, and they've got more assets at the moment that are declining, or that they've less of a decline rate built into them than what some of the other players. So other players might have shot themselves in the foot by being too aggressive going for wind or solar and not looking after the core oil supply effectively that they have. So what these guys are saying, we are tapering it down. We're not building new plants, but now you have to be with a player that's got the best current set of assets that is very well run, and that's where all that Shell stands out compared to the rest of the peers.
Great, thanks very much, Steve.